All right, you ready? What were you gonna say?
I'm in the process of making some revisions to the English major.
Like what kind of revisions?
Um, well, we're adding an internship option, or actually requirement, and we're also going to be um, uh, trying to add some more cultural engagement classes, which is a category that we created that has the C.S. Lewis Tolkien class in it, and also the film class. And part of it's because the film classes shifted from being sort of a worldview and film. It used to be Marvel film, and we just got past the change that it's going to be associated with the Sundance Film Festival, and so it's a trip to the Sundance Film Festival, and then the class is built around that. And so we're going to create a class that's a replacement, that's a pop culture and worldview class that's replacing. It's not going to go in the direction of Marvel films, but it's going to be more flexible to react to pop cultural texts and that sort of thing, and in the context of the Bible.
When I think of English, I think of like Bill Shakespeare and books, like printed books, and and then you get into the law side of things. But tell me, what does the English major have to do? Why is it so connected so closely with like Marvel, for example?
Well, I mean, it has to do with telling stories.
Okay.
So, I mean, the whole concept of narrative as a way of understanding and perceiving and communicating about the world is the foundation of English studies in a lot of ways. And it's also something that people are coming more and more to understand, that is the essence of how we understand our world is through a narrative. And so the line between a text that's written or performed is pretty thin. And as a matter of fact, I mean, Shakespeare, since you mentioned Shakespeare, I mean, it wasn't actually primarily a written media in the first place. It was a performed media. And so the closest correspondence we have in terms of what happens now is film. And so analyzing stories, analyzing the way stories are told in all different kinds of media, I think is part of the purview of the English department.
Does having a big film background, and I say that in like terms of those who watch a lot of movies, does that help or does that hinder their writing abilities? When like what your experience is with like Comp 1 in students?
I mean, I think there's. I haven't seen a direct correspondence 1-to-1, but I would imagine that just any sort of cultural awareness of different texts, whether that's written or not, does help in writing, because you understand how things, even if it's precognitive, even if it's foundational rather than something that you can actually explain, will help as you're trying to write and craft stories and ideas. Now, what we do in Comp 1 and Comp 2 isn't well, Comp 1 in particular is going to be arguments and that sort of thing.
What do you mean by arguments?
Well, expository writing that basically takes a position, supports that position, and so it's going to be not as narrative based as stories, but in Comp 2 we do analyze stories, so it's a short story or novel analysis, and in Comp 2 you're still writing persuasive texts that take a position on something, but it's blended with the storytelling aspects, because they are using that as the text that they're analyzing and taking positions on. So it helps more, I think, in Comp 2, because they're more aware of how stories work, and can think about how meaning is made through those texts. Comp 1 does a little bit more with foundational building blocks of just writing, and doesn't get as much into. I mean, we do analyze text, but it's a different kind of text and a different way that allows us to focus more on the building blocks of writing.
What are some of those building blocks that? Are there like any secrets that you know of that you could share about becoming a better writer your first year of college?
Secrets.
Well, how did you get into all this?
How did I get into all this?
Yeah, let's start there.
Wow. I did write to think through ideas. I would do, I guess you could call it journaling, thinking through ideas.
Truett calls it his diary.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's what us young kids call it.
Yeah. So I would do something like that, but
diarying.
But a lot of times
I'm just kidding.
It would be writing through concepts to try to think them out. And I mean, as I learn more and more about writing, I learn more about the connection and the relationship between thinking and writing, that in essence, writing is, there's a book I'm reading that's helping me to revamp the introductory writing class that talks about basically writing is memorialized thinking. It's thinking that you put down on paper. Mm-hmm. And so helping me to think through, I use writing to think through ideas from, how does what's the true meaning of the crucifixion? Or I can remember I wrote this long, I don't know how many pages it was, discourse on what is the soul when I was in middle school, I think, and just trying to come around to what do these concepts mean and how can we understand them. And so writing helped me to think through those. And so I actually did less actually creative. I did some creative, but more expository sort of writing where I was trying to think through concepts and lay out ideas so that I could think through them myself. That's, I guess, the first thing I came to. The second was, I remember pretty vividly, I enjoyed reading, but I can remember in my can't remember if it's sophomore or junior high school English class that we had to write something, and it was supposed to be a little creative piece, and I wrote a little story. It was like a little snippet, just a few pages, and then the rest of the class talked about it. And sitting there hearing them talk about what I had created made me think about the meaning of authorship, the idea of how we create meaning and how it's perceived by readers. And part of what I thought was really interesting was that they were coming up with ideas that I did not have about my own writing. And some of them I thought, that makes sense. It's possible that it could mean that. And I was trying to think, how could it be possible that I didn't intentionally think of that when I was creating it, and yet it could be a meaning that's in the text. And so I started to think about how much of the creative process is, use the iceberg imagery, right? Below the water level there, not visible. How much, builds from... it's an idea that J.R.R Tolkien, he talks about the pot of story in one of his writings, and in essence, all these ideas that are thrown in there, and whenever you create a story, you scoop out things that come from all these other places, and you create your own story from these pieces that are in a sense in that pot, simmering in that pot. and so it made me think a lot about how was meaning created, and that's where I decided I wanted to be an English professor. So
How old were you when you decided that?
it was either my sophomore or junior year in high school.
Okay.
Yeah. So
That's
so
pretty,
yeah.
I mean, if you're contemplating the description of a soul and trying to write about it in middle school, then surely by your junior year of high school, you've got this pretty nailed down of how important writing is to you. And do you write a lot of words, or do you try to write more with less, or what's your approach there?
Yeah, I'm pretty direct usually, and as a matter of fact, one of the things that I struggle with is just creating a lot of words, because I'm pretty efficient in terms of my word usage, and I can remember when I was doing my PhD at University of Kentucky, I wrote an article and presented it at a conference in Louisville, and the one of the organizers of the panel came up to me afterwards, and he said, I wanted to let you know that I really appreciated the fact that I could understand what you were talking about. Usually when we get people from University of Kentucky, it's full of all these words that we have no idea what it's supposed to mean. And so I've always been on the side of, it's better to be simple and clear than, throw in all this jargon and extra stuff. And so yeah, I'm on that side. And also in teaching writing, it's much better to be direct. Now you can build on that, you can expand, but I think more people actually get into trouble when they try to sound academic, when they try to sound impressive, because they use words that they don't have a grasp on, and they're trying to communicate something, and they think, well, it's supposed to sound like this. But it's more important that you just get your ideas down, and then you can revise and expand and bring in more bells and whistles, I suppose. But if you start there, then communication gets lost, which is the primary purpose.
Truett, have you ever thought about being an English major?
I have not, but I've always enjoyed writing. I always thought it's a great skill it's almost therapeutic. Like you were saying, it's kind of taking your thoughts and what was the word you used?
Memorialize.
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
Kind of them and kind of think them out. But I've always enjoyed writing, but never thought about being a music professor.
You mean an English professor?
An English professor, sorry.
Or a music professor.
Why is that on your mind?
So I was just thinking about poems just a second ago, and you were talking about Shakespeare, and I was like, well, I guess, writing down things like lyrics is kind of would be really hard. So
have you written songs?
I have tried.
It's tough.
None that I have ever sung in front of anybody or tried to perform for anything. But
what's the theory behind writing song lyrics to both of you guys? Is it about rhyming, or is it about the story, or is it about the word usage and conveying the right tone and emotion and putting the right syllables together? Like, what's the secret sauce here?
Well, that's a very complicated question, because it depends on what you think of as songs and good songs. I'm part of the reason, actually, to go back to an earlier question, part of the reason I may be an English major is because I got, I would sit and listen to my dad's records when I was young, and one of those that he listened a lot to or had a number of records of was Bob Dylan. Mm-hmm. And so trying to interpret Bob Dylan's images helped me to think through, how do you interpret, how do you understand these concepts. And so I think of Bob Dylan when I think of...
For those of us who may not listen to him as much, can you give me an example?
Well, I mean, one of his most famous songs is "Blowing in the Wind," and so he talks about. He says, "How many roads must a man walk down before you call him a man? How many seas must the white dove sail before she sleeps in the sand? How many times must the cannonballs fly before they're forever banned? The answer, my friend, is blowing in the wind. The answer is blowing in the wind. So a lot of those sorts of images that he uses to stand in for concepts and ideas, and to, the cannonballs representing the idea of war and how we relate to war and all that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
Now that's sort of in the middle of the way for Bob Dylan. There's a lot more obscure imagery in some of his.
Well, and if you're a nuclear physicist, then that song has to do with nuclear war and atom bombs, and how the wind does carry radiation, and when the last war will be. But what? Okay, but that's those who watch shows like I do and care about atom bombs. But tell me about what the answer is blowing in the wind. What does that mean? Does that just mean nobody knows?
Well, that's a good question. Especially, because you could take that so many different ways. It could be that, it's out there and you have to listen very carefully. Think of the small whisper, quiet small whisper of God, for example, mentions in the Old Testament, that you have to really pay attention to get the answer. It could mean to be, I guess, meta, use that term. It could be something that's about actually singing songs, right? Because you actually do sing the words with wind, right? Mm-hmm. With air, and so it comes out, and then the words are gone in a sense, just like bring it back to Shakespeare, just like Shakespeare talks about poetry and how the words are mentioned, but things move on. And to some degree, there is this sort of strange dichotomy between the temporality of words. And think, for example, of this podcast. I mean, you have words that are spoken and then they're gone, but now we have ways of recording them, mm-hmm. right? And so we have to memorialize. We have this history of words that are spoken, but words themselves are temporal things that mm-hmm. that blow in the wind.
If we get this podcast transcribed, will you include it in your memoir?
Is that how you say that? I thought it was memoir.
Depends on how pretentious you want to be.
Oh,
have y'all seen the TV show Shrinking?
No.
Yeah, he's like, "You gonna put that in your memoir?" And Harrison Ford goes, "It's pronounced memoir." Oh, okay. And he's like, "Hey, okay, this is my peepaw and this is my memoir." It's just a really great show. I don't recommend watching, but anyways,
I was gonna say,
I always say memoir because of that show.
Yeah, I was gonna say that concept is just crazy to me, that someone could write down that lyric, "blowing in the wind," and it could mean one thing to me who wrote it, mm-hmm. or Bob Dylan who wrote it, and then it could mean something completely different to somebody else who's listening to it, and then another person listens to it, and then they describe it to somebody else, and it just completely means something different. But then it could also all mean the same thing. So it's just that concept of it meaning so many different things is just crazy to me.
And it's obviously become a timeless lyric
mm-hmm.
that has a lot of mystery wrapped up into it, and a lot of different. But that doesn't mean everything that's written as a mystery can have a timeless effect to it. But it is interesting mm-hmm. that has stood the test of time.
Yeah, and I think what poetry is, which I do think his song lyrics are, is something that packs a whole bunch of possible meanings in a small kernel. So you have just a few words that allow for meaning to open up, which is interesting because it's in a sense opposite of what we're trying to do in the essay, which is to sort of pin down meaning, right? And so in poetry, you're putting in kernels that have all these possible meanings that come out of it, and it does get complicated because I wouldn't say that you could interpret it however you want to, just mm-hmm. like I don't think biblical passages could be interpreted however you want to.
What postmodern world do you live in? We can make it mean anything we want to, buddy.
Yeah.
Okay, welcome to 2025.
Yeah, but there are meanings that are specifically embedded by the author, and then there are meanings that come along with, to use that pot of soup image, the all the things that are brought into that particular thing that come along with it, and also within the context of the audience that's listening at the time. You mentioned nuclear war. That would have been something that that certainly in the 1960s, or early 1960s, when he wrote it, was on his mind when he's talking about war. Still, he has songs about not wanting to go into bomb shelter. One of my favorites. I will not go down under the ground when somebody tells me that death's coming round. Basically, I'm not going to go hide in a bomb shelter. But so that was on their mind. And so that is, I think, a legitimate meaning. If you move it back to, before 1940s, certainly that wouldn't have been a legitimate meaning that you could actually put in there. I mean, you could say, well, this might have interesting implications for this concept, but it wouldn't have been specifically something that the song means in the same way. So, yeah.
I'm looking at you, Truett. Are you wanting to be an English major now?
I kind of do.
Well, let's introduce
switch?
our guest today. Today we have Dr. Chris Hare, chair of the English department and communications. Is that all under one department?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So, and then you have, so you teach classes. What all do you teach?
I teach composition. I do teach the Shakespeare class. We have.
Do you ever call Bill Shakespeare?
No.
Do you know where that joke's from?
No, I don't.
It's from Chris Farley when he's playing Matt Foley.
Okay.
And one of the kids, he's trying to motivate, and he says he wants to be a writer. He's like, "Hey, Dad, is that Bill Shakespeare over there?" And anyways, he's just an idiot in the skit, but it's a really great skit.
Yeah.
Okay. You sound really impressed. Keep going. You teach Shakespeare. Okay. What else?
World literature. We have the world literature classes, and I teach primarily right now World Literature 2, although I've taught World Literature 1. I also teach some of the English literature courses, the British literature courses. Right now, I'm teaching British Literature 2, or I will in the spring again. And then there are some other courses that I teach on a rotating basis. The C.S. Lewis and Tolkien course, which is always fun. I've got an advanced comp class coming up, advanced composition. And
who is better?
Who is better, Lewis or Tolkien? Is that your? Well, that's an interesting question because it's fascinating because usually the students I have in there, they're an advocate of one or the other because they're much more familiar with one or the other. And I took a Lewis course at Baylor when I was an undergraduate and really, came to this through Lewis. It's been a lot of, I've read a lot of Lewis and much more familiar with him from a younger age. Tolkien was a later interest, and it's been interesting because sometimes Tolkien does sort of overtake when we're talking about the Lord of the Rings as opposed to Chronicles of Narnia. The storytelling of the Lord of the Rings and the depth of the mythology and the ideas that he builds in there, I think is fascinating. And in a lot of ways, I've come to appreciate that we wouldn't have Lewis without Tolkien because of the influence that Tolkien had on Lewis. And so as I read more Tolkien, I do come to appreciate him more. So that's a difficult question. Because it's hard for me to sort of separate them because their ideas are so intermingled in a lot of ways.
I ask you as a professional because, I've been chronically online since I was, 5 years old, and that's just the main discussion that comes up a lot is their differences in writing and who is better. And
well, doesn't it depend too if you're evangelical or Catholic that you would have to prefer one or the other?
Ooh, I don't know.
I'm just kidding. I'm not going to speculate on how that works for most people.
There is a difference, although Lewis is, Lewis is complicated for evangelicals as well, because there's some things that are challenges, and he was an Anglican that at times had quasi-Anglo-Catholic thoughts. So yeah, that is an interesting question, and but yeah, just the interrelatedness of their ideas. But also, I mean, you mentioned which one's better. I mean, there is this long-standing thing between, the allegory of Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe, for example, being too present and too obvious for Tolkien. He to some degrees was sort of like, that's too on the nose, right?
Yeah. He was kind of too Spielberg about showing his hand, I think, of what he's trying to convey.
Yeah, and it's interesting because a lot of people can read Tolkien without it being obvious. You can't get too far in Lewis without it being obvious that he's a Christian. But Tolkien, it's much more embedded, deeper, much deeper.
Well, can we ask you the big question?
Yes.
The movie or the book of Lord of the Rings? Which one do you like better?
I love this question.
Well, I always, as a English professor, I always go with the book.
That's what he has to say.
Yeah, because the book always has more. Well, my daughter, who actually just graduated as an English major, has a shirt that says the book was better. So yeah.
Well, what I do like about the books is that I've not read the books Lord of the Rings, but books in general is. You spend it takes so much longer to get through them. You have so much more time to appreciate, and it's kind of like watching Lost as they air instead of like binge watching it all in like 6, seasons. And you could do all that in 2 weeks if you had to, but you couldn't if you watched it live. It took you 6 years to get through it, so you appreciated the story more.
Yeah, and you can also go at your own pace.
Yeah.
One of the things about reading is that there are times where you need to slow down and take in some more complicated things, and other times where you can go a little bit faster. And the pacing is decided for you by the director when there's a film, and so you can decide that. You can decide, each performance of a character is an interpretation, right? So how do we present Gandalf or Frodo or whatever? There's some interpretive work that has to be done in order to do that, and so that's already been done for you in a film. This is Peter Jackson's interpretation of Gandalf, whereas we have Tolkien, and from that we can try to figure out what is Gandalf supposed to be, but yeah, you're put limited in some ways by a film version because it's someone's interpretation.
Yeah.
My mother, when we were younger, she made us read because we were too young to watch the movies. There was some people find it a little bit violent, at some parts of Lord of the Rings.
Yeah.
And so she made us read the books and then watch the movies later. Mm-hmm. And so we had to get all the way through the books, and I enjoyed both of them. But it made it so disappointing because I read the Hobbits first, the Hobbit books first. And then I was like, who is this? And then there would just be parts that were completely missing. So I do enjoy both of them, though.
Yeah, no Tom Bombadil. And yeah, there's a lot of things that you have to, you can't include everything. Mm-hmm. Same thing with, the Harry Potter books and the films there. You can't include everything that's in the novel. And yet Peter Jackson decides with The Hobbit to make it a 3-part and include things that are not in there. So it's interesting. He draws other things and has, here's an elf that is not in the story. Yeah.
Who never existed. We just pulled him out of a hat.
Yeah.
Some of my best friends watched Lord of the Rings. It did come out like in 2000, 2001.
2001
Okay.
to 2, 3, somewhere right in there. Yeah.
They watched it like 5 times, and they liked the books. Like they were, fans of everything. But they watched the movie, and like the third or fourth time they watched it, they started doing this joke where at the end of the movie, like they're watching it in theaters, they'd get at the end of the movie, and they'd be like, because it ends just so kind of abruptly, and with like them just walking, and they were like, "What is this? Like the movie can't end this way." And people around them be like, "Read the books, idiots!" Like just trying to like let on that they thought it was just like a beginning and an end of a whole story, not that there was going to be more stuff to it. And people were getting legitimately mad for them not knowing that there was more to this story. Which and at that point it came out, I wasn't young enough where I didn't really know much about Tolkien and the background Lord of the Rings. So I didn't watch the movies until I think after college. That's how behind I was. But I'm a huge fan of film, and I love movies. I grew up on Tommy Boy, and now like the marketers I listen to, they reference how there's an amazing story in Tommy Boy, and it follows a pattern that follows like ancient developments of how story formed. So I think that's kind of where my like love for telling stories and reading stories and using that in my marketing approach came from. Movies like Tommy Boy that I was pretty obsessed with as a kid. But so you mentioned story earlier in the narrative version of telling things and the importance there. What's in the past 15, 20 years, like what's like a favorite movie of yours that represents a strong story that you feel like probably you're attracted to it as a fan of film, and that most people probably would say, yeah, that's a great movie objectively because it follows this ancient pattern of storytelling?
Yeah, I'll have to say that Dr. Babcock does a lot more with the film. I do film through the literature, and so for example, with Shakespeare, I bring in a lot of Shakespeare film adaptations and that sort of thing. And so that's probably a better question for Dr. Babcock, because he's much more up on recent films. I'm well, not only am I older, but I'm also a little bit more of a older soul in that sense. And because you were talking about you hadn't seen the.
Well, you're the expert on the soul. You started this research in middle school.
I did. You mentioned that you didn't see those Lord of the Rings movies until after college, and I was like, yeah, me too, but for a very different reason.
yeah.
So yeah, it's hard for me to, off the top of my head, to come up with a film. I mean, you could certainly talk about the Marvel films and how they're telling stories and how, I mean, I've seen most of them, but the story arc and how everything fits together, I'll leave that up to my kids. They're much more interested in that. But there is, I mean, I like how ideas like the sacrifice of Iron Man. Sorry, spoiler alert.
Wow, big spoiler.
What?
Sure, was going to watch that movie tonight, and you just ruined it. No, if you don't know by now, then you've had it since 2019. So yeah, keep going, keep spoiling.
So how those ideas are expressed, and how to some degree, this is, to go back to Tolkien to some degree. This is the grand narrative. This is the story. This is the idea that keeps being retold. The master story, which is the gospel to some degree, is expressed in some ways, echoed, played upon, and so I think I find those ideas really interesting. If you want someone who talks more about the integrity of a particular movie, and how the story arc is developed, I would say talk to Dr. Babcock. He'd do a much better job than I would on that.
Well, let's switch gears then. Talk to me about you said you had some prompts in some of your writing classes that involve ideas and thoughts of kind of a modern conservative thinker named Jordan Peterson. Are we allowed to talk about that on here? Sure, you're in charge. Yes or no?
Yes.
Okay.
just because I don't know who Jordan Peterson is.
Oh, wow.
Is that terrible?
No, it's okay.
He is a bit controversial for some people.
He is. Yeah, people are either like, yeah, I love him, or I hate him because he's not a Christian, and I get that I think for a man who seems to know so much about the Bible, I think he misses the main point. But I'm going to give him a pass on that, because I think a lot of the other stuff that he has written about, and ideas and themes that he picks up on that are either in the Bible or just in like modern culture, I think he's helpful. That's a good way. He's been really helpful in my experience with his writings and the podcast that he's on. So, but yeah,
and there is a concept that all truth is God's truth, and so when you approach the truth, it fits within what God presents. Whether that's there's some truths in Nietzsche and other writers that are very anti-Christian. And so you can take a lot from that. But it is interesting looking at Jordan Peterson's movement that he has embraced the Christian stories, at least, and how he's talked. I was actually listening to a podcast where they were talking about the Gospels not too long ago. Mm-hmm. But yeah, he also has some really interesting ideas about writing, and as a matter of fact, some of his debates with Dawkins are really sort of. He had a relatively recent one where he was talking with Richard Dawkins and talking about how, when it came down to it, they agreed on a lot as far as the science goes, but Dawkins has a very scientific, fact-based understanding of truth, whereas Jordan Peterson has a very narrative understanding of truth. So truth is a narrative, is a story, and so yeah, it's very based on that, and he actually has some writing things that I think do have some value. I was looking at some of his materials there that take what can be useful there. Yeah. So what was your question about him? Sorry, we didn't.
Yeah. A few months ago, you mentioned that there's like either he had like a prompt or something that you used as like just like a general question that you had your students write about. I was just curious how you utilized some of his resources to draw stuff out of students, I guess.
Yeah, so I think to some degree, although I don't know that he explicitly states this in relation to that prompt, but there is he has talked about the fact that he has used in some of his classes and is incorporated in some of his other material an analysis of the students' goals and objectives and what you need to overcome to achieve those, and I've used something similar in some of my a writing lab class I've taught, and also I'm incorporating it into this introductory writing class that I'm designing this summer to launch in the fall, and so it's basically having the students think about, in essence, their own narrative, right? What is the story that they are telling? What's the story that they're in the middle of? What are the goals that they're trying to achieve, and what might get in the way of achieving those goals? And one of the things he has talked about is he thinks that putting those things down, working those out in your own story, in essence, trying to think through your own story and what you want to achieve and how you can achieve those and why it's important to achieve those goals, helps students to stick to it when it gets difficult. I actually I don't think when he came up with this idea, I don't think he had progressed to where he is now in terms of understanding of the biblical story. And so it seems to me very much entangled with some of the focus that he sees, because he sees the ultimate goal, the ultimate good to some degree, as self-sacrifice.
Yeah.
And so in the context of that writing assignment, part of the question is, what do I have to sacrifice of what I want now in order to achieve the things that I think are lasting and more important. And so that's something that I do think resonates and is important with our students. And so I'm bringing it into that class. I've used it in some other classes, is to think about, is this really important to me to achieve my academic goals, my spiritual goals, my sports goals, whatever your goals are. Is this important enough for me to sacrifice the present pleasures that I have, the short-term sort of goals, to achieve long-term goals, and it should really sort of orient them toward what has meaning, in a sense, what has meaning in their lives, and if it has meaning, if it really does mean something, then we should be willing to stick through it and overcome those challenges, and I do think that's something that our students need to think about. I think it's something that many of them haven't really had to think about in a lot of ways. And so I think thinking about long-term goals and thinking about having to sacrifice for those is worthwhile, even though it may not always be what you want to think about.
Yeah. Well, I'm 36 and I still think about those things and find value in that. What am I sacrificing today? Big or small, in order to get to where I want to be and where I need to be, something else that he talks about is taking on more responsibility, and is not the natural way of thinking that you're going to find more purpose and fulfillment in life. It's it's actually getting out of responsibility and being more free, but the exact opposite's true. And I'm not saying obviously being free is important, but being tied down, whether it's with your family or raising kids, that's maximum responsibility. And there's so much joy and so much purpose and so much fulfillment, yet it's massive amounts of responsibility.
Yeah. And I not to get too philosophical, but I do think we have in our culture, we have a misunderstanding of freedom, where we see freedom as a lack of restraints, that we can do whatever we want. And so, freedom to do whatever we want. Whereas we really should be thinking about freedom in order to do something that's worthwhile, in order to freedom to be who we can and should be, freedom in essence, from a Christian perspective, to be who God wants us to be who God has intended for us to be, rather than less than that. And so freedom isn't just, I can do whatever I want. To some degree, freedom is the ability to have the choice to sacrifice for something larger than yourself. And that's paradoxical for a lot of people. It's difficult to sort of wrap your mind around that. But I think that does come down to, things we need to focus on.
So how do you incorporate all that into the English department? How does this play out in your teaching and lectures and assignments?
Yeah, so it does, like I mentioned, that specific assignment, but it works itself out in looking at the worldviews that are embedded within things, the worldviews that are embedded within Marvel movies. I know that's something that Dr. Babcock focused on very much in that class. The worldviews that are embedded in certain pieces of literature, the worldviews that are embedded, to some degree within us by culture, as we were just talking, our concepts of freedom, the way we understand it, our concepts of sacrifice and achievement, that to some degree we need to reorient ourselves for that. I'll talk about world literature, for example, in my World Literature 2 classes. One of the things that I start from the very beginning as we're analyzing this literature is what ideas, what worldviews, ways of seeing the world are at stake or are clashing here. Because in essence, every piece of literature has some sort of conflict, and at the bottom of the conflict is different ways of seeing what's good and what's bad, and what's worthwhile, what's not worthwhile. And so what the author is doing is presenting, we could look at it this way, we could look at it this way, and there's one way that the author is trying to get you to move in that sense. And so these sorts of ideas, I think, are ideas that we I know Dr. Babcock does it as well. But ideas that we talk about as we analyze literature is not just, what happens, but why it happens and what it signifies about the world, how we understand the world, what it signifies about what the author is trying to present, what embedded values are within that, and what's important. What is the ultimate good here, right? We Thanos, who thinks the ultimate good is to balance the universe through numbers, or are we supposed to be more like Iron Man, who thinks the ultimate good is to sacrifice for others, right? So I think those are things that we are unique, or at least distinctive from a lot of other places, in the sense that we spend a lot of time when we're analyzing the literature. As a matter of fact, I think that's the purpose of analyzing the literature, is to look at what are the values that are embedded here, and how do they relate to our current world, and how they relate to biblical values, the biblical worldview, and the way we should look at things.
I have to say, from a student's perspective, analyzing something, because I took Comp 1 and Comp 2 in high school, analyzing something is one of the hardest skills I had to learn to do, because you always want to naturally just summarize something and not analyze it. And so that was one of the hardest skills I ever had to learn. But
Yeah. Analysis, I always tell my students, analysis is basically like trying to figure out how an engine works by taking it apart and looking at how all the pieces work together. And so it's not just saying this is what happens. It's, it is, why does this happen? What is going on here? What's the meaning that's being built? What's the story? And it is a challenging thing, but it's part of what, it's part of critical thinking. It's that's in essence the core of critical thinking, is being able to look at something and take it apart, not just to dismantle it, but to figure out how it works.
absolutely.
So you're an outdoorsy guy too?
Me?
Yeah. You hike, run, trail run, cycle? What all do you do?
Yeah, I used to do a number of trail runs and bicycles, trails, and that sort of thing. It's been a little bit harder here, actually, to have access to those.
A little bit flatter.
Yeah, it's a little flatter. There's I used to live, a mile and a half away from a really nice trail and that sort of thing. But I do, I enjoy being outside. I do, while I'm running, while I'm exercising, it does allow me to think, and I enjoy that. The ability to be away from things for a while, and also there is, to some degree, I grew up playing all different kinds of sports, and I do think sports are a way to learn what we were talking about earlier in terms of short-term gains, long-term goals, and that sort of thing, because you have to sacrifice.
Buffalo Wild Wings at 11 p.m.
Yeah.
You can't do that if you're wanting to be an athlete.
Yeah, or sleeping in, right? You have to get up and you have to go for your run and you have to exercise in order to do that. And that's keeping in mind the goals that you have in the future, because you think those are more important, right? And that is life. So I do think that's important. But I do enjoy being outdoors. I'm a terrible fisherman. But I enjoy doing things outside.
Where do you like to run at here?
I don't like to take a lot of time to get to where I want to run, which is part of the difficulty.
Sure.
And so mostly I run around here. There's a little trail that sometimes I run.
Like the rail trail?
Yeah, it's paved.
Yeah.
And you can only do it certain times of the year for various
For
reasons.
bug reasons, yeah.
Yeah.
Always good to cycle on it, though. Never any bug problems there.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay.
Because you're going too fast.
Okay.
Or at least I am. I don't know about Druid.
You just have to have glasses on and
oh,
not
yeah.
open your mouth.
Yeah, don't open your mouth, yeah. No, that's usually the question a lot of people ask me whenever they, like, do you just not swallow bugs the whole time? That has not been my experience, but I understand why people think that, because bugs.
Yeah.
But, no, True and I are doing a project this summer where we're going to hit up all the 5 state parks in this area and try to showcase the hiking, kayaking, cycling, all those kinds of stuff. So I'm pretty excited about that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
But they're all like 20, 30 minutes away.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, and I've gone to a few places and I enjoy that, but it's for my weekly, daily exercise. It's hard to it's hard enough to set aside the time to exercise,
sure,
and then the time to travel to exercise is on the top of that is difficult.
Yeah. Well, especially when you're trying to manage a family and a schedule and get all your movie time in. Just kidding. Reading time.
A schedule.
Yeesh. Well, Dr. Hare, thank you for coming on today and talking about this. Is there anything else you want to talk about? You have the degree plan sitting in front of you, but they can find that online if they wanted to. But go ahead. Tell us what you're.
They can find that online. I mean, I will say that I do think, and I've heard this from people that have gone other places and gone here as well, is that I think our analysis of the fundamental narratives, think of the narratives that we study, and then the master narrative, which is the grand arc of history. For me, of course, as a Christian, that is controlled, guided, directed by God. I think is one of the things that we definitely have to offer. We also provide a very strong foundation in different in the literary historical time period. I did have someone who went off. Well, we have a number of people that go off to do their master's or PhD at University of Arkansas or Arkansas State or other places, and they always talk about how they're well prepared for having the foundations they need in literature, and also in terms of theory. I mean, we do talk about theory, but we're going to put that within a Christian framework and understand it within a larger relationship of a larger framework. So I think that's important. So I did want to mention those because I think that we do have a strong foundation just in the literature, but also in other things. I mean, we have a creative writing class. I mentioned the advanced comp class. And so we do prepare grammar. We do prepare students to be, to go into the next stage, whatever that may be. But I think one of the big things we do prepare them to is to think about how the stories relate to larger stories.
Yeah.
And that's not everywhere.
Yeah. I think people will be surprised at how that is not everywhere and not very common, in fact. So, yeah. You get one idea of what college is like from movies, another idea from the reality, and then another idea from colleges like ours that do have a Christian value foundation and vision. So it's not just about where we've been, but it's about where we're going.
Yeah, and I'll just a little plug for the school as a whole, I suppose. I do think Christian education is very important because it as I mentioned before, all truth is God's truth, in the sense that things are not at some universities they're less a university than a multiversity because it's all these different areas that study their own little thing. And I think here, one of the things that we can offer, and we do offer, is a more unified vision, how everything relates to that larger narrative, how math fits together with science, fits together with the humanities, and how all of these fit within a larger tapestry of what's going on in the world. And so, I do think that our students are different in a lot of different ways that are positive.
Yep. Well said. Good plug. We'll end it there. Thanks again for joining us.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you.